Tehran woke up under a sky that looked wrong. Not just cloudy, not just gray, wrong. By Sunday morning, parts of the Iranian capital were covered by thick, dark smoke after overnight strikes hit multiple fuel depots and petroleum sites around the city. Residents described blackened rain, soot on cars and balconies, and air that felt difficult to breathe. In a city of nearly 10 million people, that kind of shift does not feel like a distant military event. It feels immediate. It feels personal. It changes the way people move, the way they breathe, the way they think about the next hour, not just the next week. And that is the real story here. This is not only a military headline, it is a civilian reality story. When fuel depots burn in or near a major population center, the damage is not confined to the point of impact. Smoke travels, residue settles, fear spreads faster than both. And in a capital as large and dense as Tehran, even a few hours of toxic smoke can reshape daily life across entire neighborhoods. What we know is serious enough without exaggeration. Several fuel storage and petroleum-related sites were reported hit, including the Shahran depot, the Agdassi oil warehouse, an oil refinery in the south, and a depot in Karaj. Israel said it targeted fuel storage complexes it claimed were linked to the IRGC and used to distribute fuel to military entities. Iranian officials and residents, meanwhile, described wider civilian consequences, especially from the smoke and fallout after the fires. The key point is this: whatever the intended target list was, the visible result for ordinary residents was a major pollution event over one of the region's largest cities. That is where this script begins. With the gap between a strike on infrastructure and the lived experience of the people under the plume, residents quoted in reporting described seeing rain darkened by soot, cars coated in grime, and a sky that no longer looked natural. One person said the rain was black, even miles away from the oil tanks. Another said a white car turned almost black overnight. A teacher described the air as unbreathable and said even short exposure left her with a headache, throat irritation, and sore skin. Whether every report of black rain turns out to be chemically identical across districts is not the main point. The main point is that enough soot and combustion residue entered the air that many residents experienced the event as a public health emergency, not simply a wartime headline. And the health concerns were not abstract. Iran's Red Crescent warned that rainfall after the strikes could be dangerous and acidic, with risks including chemical irritation and serious lung damage. Al Jazeera reported Iranian officials and emergency voices warning about toxic hydrocarbons, sulfur compounds, and nitrogen oxides in the smoke. Those are the kinds of pollutants that immediately raise concerns for people with asthma, cardiovascular disease, or other respiratory vulnerabilities. Children, older adults, and anyone already dealing with poor air quality are usually hit first and hardest in this kind of event. That matters because Tehran is not a small town with a narrow exposure zone. It is a massive urban center where a pollution plume can affect millions of people at once. This is also why careful wording matters. It is tempting, especially on YouTube, to describe every wartime environmental event in the most dramatic possible language, but the safest and strongest approach is to stick to what is supported. Thick smoke covered parts of Tehran. Many residents reported soot-laced rain and breathing difficulties. The Red Crescent issued a serious warning, and officials advised residents to stay indoors. That is already a major story. We do not need unsupported superlatives to make it feel important, because it is important. The visual impact alone tells you why this story is resonating. A modern capital with highways, apartments, schools, hospitals, offices, and millions of routines suddenly finds itself under a dark industrial haze. Smoke becomes part of the cityscape. Soot becomes part of household life. People start wiping balconies, windows, and vehicles and asking the same question: what exactly are we breathing? In conflicts, people often fear the blast in the moment. But afterwards, another fear takes over, the invisible one. What is in the air? What is in the rain? What settles into water, soil, clothing, and lungs after the cameras leave? That fear is rational. History gives people reasons to take it seriously. Oil fires and burning fuel infrastructure have a long record of creating environmental and health damage that outlasts the strike itself. Al Jazeera's reporting explicitly drew historical comparisons to the 1991 Kuwaiti oil fires and the burning of Iraq's Qayyara oil fields during the fight against ISIS. In both cases, combustion products, soot, and toxic residues created prolonged air quality problems and wider environmental fallout. That does not mean Tehran's situation will unfold in exactly the same way or at the same scale. It means people are not imagining the danger when they worry that burning fuel sites can create consequences beyond the immediate blast zone. There's another layer here that matters for a policy-safe script: the distinction between what is confirmed and what is interpretation. Confirmed, major fuel-related sites were struck. Large fires produced thick black smoke. Residents reported breathing problems and darkened rainfall. Israel publicly took responsibility for targeting certain fuel complexes. Emergency warnings were issued. Reported, but more interpretive. claims about the broader strategic purpose of these strikes, including arguments that the attacks are meant to break civilian resilience or pressure the population. Analysts quoted by Al Jazeera make those arguments, and they are part of the conversation, but they should be framed as analysis, not stated as settled fact. That distinction protects both accuracy and credibility. Still, even without overstating motive, the civilian effect is clear. When petroleum storage burns near a major city, the damage is not just to infrastructure. It becomes a disruption of ordinary life. People stay inside. Some leave the city if they can. Roads change as people try to move away from the worst air. Families start rationing exposure, especially for children and older relatives. Windows stay shut. Headaches and sore throats stop feeling incidental and start feeling like warnings. And the psychological effect is huge. The sky itself begins to look hostile. That psychological dimension is often underestimated in war coverage. A strike can be over in minutes, but the atmosphere it creates can dominate the day. The smoke is a message even when nobody says a word. It tells people they are close to danger. It tells them the line between battlefield and civilian space is thinner than they hoped. It tells them that basic assumptions, that rain is just rain, that going outside for 15 minutes is harmless, that a city can recover overnight from a single round of strikes, may no longer hold. Then there's the fuel question. Al Jazeera reported that Iran's petroleum ministry cut daily civilian fuel rations from 30 liters to 20 liters after the depot strikes. That detail matters because it shows the story is not only about smoke overhead, it is also about logistics on the ground. Fuel is a system, not just a commodity. It affects transport, supply chains, access to essentials, and the pace of daily life. When storage and distribution nodes are damaged, even people far from the fires can feel the impact through rationing, queues, delays, and uncertainty about what comes next. 4 employees, including 2 tanker drivers, were reported killed in the depot strikes. Another reminder that infrastructure attacks also hit workers whose jobs place them directly in harm's way. That leads to one of the most important truths in this story. Industrial infrastructure is never only industrial. A fuel depot is not just tanks and pipes. It is transport. It is deliveries. It is emergency response. It is work shifts. It is access. It is everything downstream from the moment fuel leaves storage and enters everyday life. When that chain is interrupted, the immediate image is smoke, but the medium-term consequence is friction everywhere else. A city does not need total system collapse to suffer. It only needs enough disruption in the right places. And Tehran is already a city where scale magnifies everything. Nearly 10 million people means even a localized strike can become a metropolitan problem once smoke drifts, roads clog, or warnings spread. That scale is why videos and eyewitness accounts from this event felt so intense. You were not watching smoke over an isolated facility. You were watching a haze settle over a city large enough that millions of people could see some version of the same sky at once. There is also a broader regional context that makes this more than a local pollution story. Time describes the depot strikes as part of an expanding conflict that has already produced more than 1,000 reported civilian deaths in Iran, according to cited reporting, retaliatory missile and drone attacks across the region, and growing infrastructure damage well beyond military facilities. The same coverage notes damage claims involving desalination plants, airports, and fuel infrastructure in Gulf states. In other words, this is not an isolated environmental accident. It is part of a conflict pattern in which infrastructure itself is increasingly central. And civilians end up breathing, paying for, or fleeing the consequences. That broader context matters because it changes how we should talk about this event. The easy YouTube version would be to turn the whole thing into apocalypse language, but the more responsible version is actually stronger. This strike shows how modern war reaches into daily life through infrastructure. Not always by flattening entire cities in one moment, but by targeting the systems that make urban life function. Fuel, water, electricity, roads, logistics. And once those systems are hit, daily life becomes fragile very quickly. And the environmental side is not a side issue. It is part of the conflict itself. Iranian officials described the environment as a silent victim of the war. Even if you set aside political rhetoric, the underlying point stands. Smoke from burning fuel does not care whether someone supports a government, opposes it, or wants nothing to do with politics at all. Soot settles on every surface it reaches. Pollutants move with wind, temperature, and rain, not ideology. In that sense, environmental fallout is one of the most indiscriminate dimensions of modern conflict. It can turn entire neighborhoods into exposure zones without asking anyone's permission. This is why one of the most revealing details in the reporting is how ordinary the witnesses sound. They are not talking like analysts. They are talking like people trying to understand what happened to their car, their balcony, their throat, their child's breathing, their ability to step outside. That ordinary register is important. It cuts through rhetoric. It reminds us that for civilians, war is often experienced less as a grand strategic narrative than as a series of practical questions. Is the air safe? Should we leave? Can we drive? Can children go outside? Is the water okay? How long will this smoke last? Those are the questions that define a real crisis, and they are the questions that make this title work when handled carefully. A wasquiu, black rain crisis, should not be used as a sensational phrase detached from evidence. It works only if the script immediately grounds it in what residents reported and what emergency warnings said. That grounding matters because otherwise a strong title can become misleading. Here, the title is defensible because there were widespread resident descriptions of blackened rainfall and visible soot fallout, and because authorities warned about the health risks associated with polluted rain and smoke after the depot fires. At the same time, a good final version should resist one common mistake, saying more than the evidence supports. We do not need to claim every part of Tehran was equally affected. We do not need to declare permanent contamination without testing data. We do not need to say every report of irritation proves the same chemical exposure. The stronger move is to be exact. There were multiple reported strikes on fuel-related sites, fires burned for hours, thick smoke spread across the city. Residents reported soot-darkened rainfall and breathing difficulties. Emergency warnings described serious risk. That is enough. And once you say only what can be supported, the human significance becomes clearer. A city does not need to be flattened to be wounded. Sometimes it is wounded through the atmosphere itself, through a sky that changes color, through residue on surfaces, through the decision to cancel a trip, keep a child inside, leave town, or cover your face because you do not trust the air. The smoke over Tehran is a picture of how war turns infrastructure into a civilian hazard. It is a reminder that industrial targets in dense urban spaces carry consequences that spread beyond the strike coordinates. That is also why this event is likely to stay in public memory. People remember dramatic explosions, but they also remember abnormal weather, unnatural residue, and the feeling that even rain can no longer be trusted. Images of a city under black smoke linger because they symbolize something larger, the moment when ordinary urban life starts to feel chemically, physically, and psychologically altered. If there is one conclusion to take from all of this, it is not that we should race toward the biggest possible claim, it is that we should pay close attention to how infrastructure warfare works in real life. It does not always announce itself through a single decisive battlefield outcome. Sometimes it arrives as smoke over apartment blocks, soot on vehicles, headaches after a short drive, emergency warnings to stay indoors, and fuel ration cuts that ripple through everyday life. That is what makes Tehran's black rain crisis more than a viral image. It is a case study in how fast a strike on fuel storage can become a metropolitan public health story. It is a reminder that when petroleum burns near population centers, the first wave is fire, the second is smoke, the third is uncertainty. What is in the air? How far did it travel? How long will it last? Who is most at risk? What happens to a city when people stop trusting the sky above it? Those questions are bigger than one day of headlines. And for the civilians under that sky, they are not theoretical at all. They are the crisis.